Your ears do not deceive you. You have just entered the Cryptid Creator Corner, brought to you by your friends at Comic Book Yeti. So without further ado, let's get on to the interview.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Cryptid Creator Corner. I'm Byron O'Neill, your host for a lovely little chat with returning guest David Pepose. David came on way back to promote Savage Avengers with me, and since then he's been super busy working on, frankly, some of the coolest characters in the Marvel Universe. You've got the Fantastic Four and Moon Knight, and most recently in a book, which I've enjoyed quite a bit, The Punisher. You might also remember him coming on and chatting with Jimmy last fall about The Devil That Wears My Face from Mad Cave Studios. We're on issue 5 of that delightfully diabolical series. That's right, David?
That's correct.
Okay. And it's fair to say you've been super, super busy. So most recently, we've all been getting hyped up for his new writing gig, working for Dynamite Studios, relaunching another IP we all know and love, Space Ghost. So David, you doing well?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, busy is exactly the right word to use to describe my last couple of years. Just kind of bouncing from project to project and new idea to new idea. And yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience, and I'm so excited to get to talk with you about my brand new book, Space Ghost, coming out May 1st, the Wednesday before Free Comic Book Day.
Yeah, I thought I'd try to do my best attempt at, kind of the long cartoon intro, but I remembered I can't sing and nobody really wants to hear that. I have fondly remember the original, animated TV series as a kid. As he's got his own wonderful, version of a Rose Gallery similar to Batman, because heroes only as good as its villains, right? So you have Moltar and Brak and Zorak and Metallus, I love them all. So did you grow up watching was it 1966? Was that when it was first came
1966
out?
was when the original series came out. So
Yeah.
I'm a little younger than that, but
Yeah.
my introduction to Space Ghost was as a child of the 90s, was Coast to Coast.
Okay.
And it wasn't until I got my first internship in the industry. I was an intern at DC Comics when they were doing Final Crisis and Batman R.I.P. And that's when I started to learn about the history of comics and some of the leading figures in the industry. And so Alex Toth was one of those figures. And so I learned at that point that Space Ghost actually got his start the same year as Adam West's Batman. It was a traditional superhero take, granted told in the style of the times, which was a lot of camp, but also just kind of like the crazy Silver Age excitement of it all, just kind of throwing concepts against the wall and seeing what sticks. But when you're working with Alex Toth, all those concepts are fastballs, and so, like you said, so many of those characters and concepts and villains really did stick. They were so just based on sheer look and sheer design that there was a lot of longevity to the character. So the way I wound up getting approached about this series is I've known Nick Barucci at Dynamite for some time, even back to my earliest days in comics journalism.
Okay.
And so when I made the shift to becoming a writer, I would hit up certain publishers, just be like, "Hey, I've got a new book out. Would love to stay on your radar." And Dynamite was one of those. And it was having worked on I think Moon Knight, City of the Dead, and Punisher back to back, that it was Nate Cosby over there who said, I think David would be a good fit on Space Ghost. And so he passed my portfolio to Joe Rybant, my editor on the book, and Joe agreed. So it was New York Comic Con last year. Dynamite had just announced that their new initiative with Warner Brothers, where they're going to be doing a line of licensed books, starting with Declan Shalvey and Drew Moss on Thundercats. And Joe came up to my table at New York and said, "Listen, I know you've emailed us a lot. I don't know if you saw, we have the rights to Space Ghost, and you're the top of our list. Would you be interested?"
Sweet.
And it was it was so exciting being able to kind of tell this really cool superhero story with all these amazing sci-fi trappings. But as I dug more and more into the project, I realized this was a unique opportunity. This is a superhero story that isn't tied in any particular universe. So you can really kind of run with these characters and actually make lasting emotional through lines and actual character arcs. And I really, as I started rewatching all the episodes, it became very clear to me that, this is an ensemble. This is an ensemble piece. This is the story of Space Ghost and his sidekicks, Jan, Jace, and Blip. and watching their dynamic evolve, and how did they first meet, and then watching them become trusted sidekicks, and then trusted partners, and then a surrogate found family in their own right.
Right.
It struck me as the kind of superhero story that, just by the nature of the industry, is very difficult to tell anywhere else. If you're telling Batman, you have to tell that story for 60 plus years. And so there winds up being relaunches and sort of a generational element, particularly in the sidekicks. But that's not the case for Space Ghost. Space Ghost, you can't have another Jan and Jace. And so being able to play with that has been a really exciting opportunity, and unlike anything I've been able to write before.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up one of those mid '80s, cartoon relaunches a couple of weeks back. I gotta say that particular one was not my favorite. Right, I'm not gonna mention it because I know everyone has their own taste, and I'm not about squashing anybody else's joy. But I feel like sometimes it can be a bit tricky to get that balance right when kind of between respecting the legacy and doing something inventive with it. So there's that consideration here, because Space Ghost doesn't have 60 70 years of like entrenched mythology,
Sure.
but you have Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which that was your introduction point,
That's my
which has a
introduction.
very different tone than like the
Sure.
original cartoon. So
Yeah. Well, I think for me, the way that I wanted to approach this was, I was acutely aware that there's a whole generation of people who have no idea who Space Ghost is, or
yeah,
they only know the look, or they only know him as a talk show host, but they don't realize that the original vision was that of a traditional superhero. And so, from my very first discussions with Dynamite and Warner Brothers, we were all pretty much in agreement that we wanted to reclaim Space Ghost and bring him back to his roots. But while that original cartoon, like I said, was very much in the style of the time, Adam West's Batman, high camp. What I wanted to do was kind of take all the amazing concepts and energy and vibes from the original Space Ghost and bring it into the 21st century. How do we kind of tell these stories with these characters with the storytelling sensibilities of 2024?
hmm
And so the tone that I kind of liken this book to is somewhere in between a Batman the Animated Series and Batman the Long Halloween.
okay,
So it's a more serious take, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's a grim take. It's definitely, if anything, I would consider this book really a study in contrasts, where you have the moments of drama and the moments of tension and action and cosmic high flying adventure, but also, thanks to the thrust of the book being about Space Ghost dynamic with Jan, Jace, and Blip, you
yeah.
have the humor, and you have the heart, and you have the moments of warmth and wonder. And so I think, for me as a storyteller, I keep saying the word gift, but that's exactly what it is that you're able to kind of run the gamut of the tones you can play with, and the sort of genres you can tap into,
Yeah.
and the various tones you can play between, and it all feels organic, and it all feels true to the book. And so I think for me, as somebody who tends to get restless while writing, as particularly if I have to stay in any one lane, this really gives me the opportunity to kind of follow my heart, and it doesn't feel out of place.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sort of blown away at times the amount of legwork comics writers do to know the ins and outs of like continuums of different characters. I mean, I was re-listening to your chat with Jimmy about Devil Wears My Face,
Yeah,
and listening to all of the background that you went into in the research with all the popes and
yeah.
such. So I'm just assuming you went back and like watched all the old cartoons.
I rewatched every episode. I rewatched every episode of the original '60s run. I rewatched every episode of the '80s revival and Space Stars. I even watched Space Ghost team up with Batman and the Brave and the Bold. I reread every comics appearance that I could get my hands on,
Wow.
so including Joe Kelly and Ariel Olivetti's Batman Begins style origin of the character.
Yeah.
What Jeff Parker and Doc Shanner did in Future Quest, as well as Future Quest Presents. Um, Even Mark Evanier and Steve Rude did an amazing Space Ghost one shot for Comico back in the day, and I managed to get my hands on a copy of that. And so The only thing longer than the pitch document I sent to Dynamite, which was somewhere 30-something pages, was the notes I took. There's a 40-something page document that I have in my Google Docs where every single episode I took detailed notes.
Whoa.
And so that way, like, it really kind of helped me get a sense of like the rhythm of Space Ghost, but also it was a great way to look at particularly his rogues gallery with like a fresh set of eyes.
Yeah.
And to say, okay, like what about Zorak really stands out to me? And so for me, I see him as it's reductive to call him the Joker to Batman or to Space Ghost Batman, but he is the villain that like he's his arch nemesis. He's the one that like Space Ghost, if he's afraid of any of them, it's probably Zorak. And I see it as, he's a homicidal praying mantis. Like he inherently looks at the world in an alien way to you and I. Whereas Space Ghost is the guy who like he's playing at being a monster just by virtue of his name and the way that he moves. Zorak is a monster. And so like things like that. And how do we kind of what wrinkles can we add to that character to really highlight something like that alien way of thinking?
Okay.
Or something like Brak, for example, who I love Brak because he strikes me. He reminds me a little of Taskmaster over at Marvel, in that he's not looking to conquer the universe or anything. He's almost blue collar. He's a mercenary. He's a pirate. He's a guy who's looking for the paycheck. He just wants to rob the next gold freighter. And so like things like that, like, okay, how do we add new wrinkles that play up to Brak's opportunistic streak?
Okay.
And so being able to do stuff like that with each of the characters, or even the Widow, something as I was writing her that really stood out to me was, oh, she's the only woman in the Council of Doom. And meanwhile, Jan is the only woman, the only girl in sort of this surrogate family. What's somehow the Widow kind of finds this like sick maternal streak, like almost a weird bond. She sees something in Jan that she sees in herself. And so, things like that have been like a really cool way to explore Space Ghost's rogues gallery, who you hit it on the head. I think it's every bit as iconic as Batman or Spider-Man or the Flash. And so the fact that nobody's really been able to get into those villains in a deep way, Zorak has like a quick appearance in Joe Kelly's run, and there, Metallus shows up in Future Quest Presents, but we've never been able to do the long Halloween of it all, where we're able to kind of do the world tour of Space Ghost Rogues. And so I think that's a cool way, though, to kind of rack up adventures very, very quickly. And so for all those people who don't know who Space Ghost is, they're going to quickly figure out who he is and what he's about.
Were there any, I guess, hiccups in sort of the creative process, right? So how much control did Dynamite give you? Because you got a whole bunch of comics iterations, right? You have Gold Key and Archie and DC and now Dynamite. So yeah. So I'm just trying to get a...
No, if anything, the freedom is the word that I would use to describe every single bit of this process. I think that's part of the reason why I'm so excited about this book is, I've written at Marvel for several years at this point. And, going in that like there is a flow of traffic that's already happening. There are other people using all sorts of different characters and you have no idea who's using what. That's what your editors are there for, is they know where all the bodies are buried. And so sometimes that restriction is kind of fun, but it's also part of the challenge is you don't always get all the characters you want. And you sort of have to tell the story in the way that you've envisioned it, but you have to be smart about it. You have to kind of think things through and have backup plans. Space Ghost, if anything, I really kind of get to follow my true north. Because there's no other books that I have to navigate. And if anything, I was told, pretty explicitly, this is its own continuity. It's a brand new publisher. I didn't think it was right to try to crib off of like what Joe Kelly or Jeff Parker did over at DC. I didn't think it was right, but also I wasn't sure what the legality of all that would be. So this is brand new continuity. All you have to do to get into this story is read issue 1. You don't have to do any homework.
Okay.
But yeah, I think the thing that we all kind of recognized pretty quickly, the original Space Ghost, those episodes are like 5 or 6 minutes a pop. There's no continuity, so to speak. There's no backstory. Space Ghost arrives fully formed, fighting a lava monster. And Jan and Jace and Blip are already there. There's really no explanation as to like how they met up or, how did they become sidekicks. And, there's been the occasional stab at like explaining who Space Ghost is. But for me, I feel like Space Ghost, if anything, his origin feels very simple to me. It's this is a guy who has been spurred on to fight crime across the galaxy. What would drive somebody to do that? Probably some degree of personal tragedy. In that, his planet was attacked by space pirates. He's the sole survivor of Ghost Planet. He's going to try to stop what happened to him from happening to anybody else. Okay. But at the same time, I think what's been so cool about Space Ghost, and particularly his dynamic with Jan and Jason Blip, is when we meet Space Ghost, he's been pretty isolated for a while. He's been on this crusade, and he's really good at fighting pirates, but at the same time, I think emotionally he's been in kind of an arrested development. He's never moved on from any of this. And moreover, he's never had an opportunity to heal because he's not really interacting with anybody else. And as you'll see in our first issue, as the circumstances unfold, that he has to take in Jan and Jason Blip, it's an interesting dynamic in that for Jan and Jace, their tragedy is pretty fresh. And at the same time, they're kids, and kids can be pretty resilient. And they have each other, which I think is something that I think sets them apart from somebody like Bruce Wayne, who it was just him. He
Sure.
kind of collapsed in on himself in terms of his own personal tragedy. But seeing the way that all these characters do react to tragedy, I think is really interesting. Space Ghost is, at least at first, kind of gruff. He has his own way of doing things, and he is not open to any interference in that regard. Whereas Jan's the responsible one. She's the one who, I think, like a lot of only girls in a family, she's the one who, like, she has to think things through. Her brother's not going to do it. And Space Ghost can be kind of tunnel visioned. So she has to think it. That's being responsible is how she feels she can keep the family together.
Okay.
But she's also tough. She's feisty. Like, I don't think she knows that this is the role that she's in, but she doesn't love that. And so that does kind of give her a feisty streak. She's the one who will tell off Space Ghost to his face.
Yeah.
She's a crack shot with a blaster too, which I think kind of adds a little bit of weight when Jan wants something, it gets done. Whereas Jace, he's kind of like, he's like Tim from Jurassic Park. And, if Jan is like Lex. He's impulsive. He's the one who kind of will leap before he looks. He's got the great sense of humor. Jace feels like if he can kind of keep morale up, if he can keep people laughing, if he can keep telling jokes, that's how he keeps the family together. So I think there's an inherent sweetness to him, even if like he runs his mouth. But also, like, I love that Jace, while he probably wasn't like great in school, he's like a natural mechanic. Like, he's good with his hands. He knows how to pilot things, and he's got this. He brings a lot of the joy to all of this. That he's like, we get to be superheroes. Like, how cool is this? And so watching Jan and Jace's contrast with each other, and then watching how they play off a Space Ghost, it really. This whole business is about like investment in characters, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I know that you can tell all the cool, exciting spectacle all you want, but if you don't feel anything for these characters, it doesn't mean anything. And I feel like a book like Space Ghost, we're really able to double down issue to issue. Why should we care about these people? Like, who are they? Like, what are their personalities and their dynamics with one another? And I think I see it as, the story of kind of the ultimate cosmic single dad, and how he's in over his head a little bit, but how he starts to roll with it, and how he starts to grow and heal from it, and how kind of all these characters start to learn from each other. And sometimes there will be setbacks, but those setbacks, it's sort of, one step back, 2 steps forward. And I think ultimately, like all of my favorite books that I've written, it's all about the redemptive climb. And I think that the way they do it is through each other.
Okay. Well, what about Blip? Because you have kind of
Yeah.
it's a free swing always with an animal, like,
Yep.
or Orko for that matter, right? Like it's
Yeah, well, it's funny. Blip is so important. I think, when I was rewatching all the original Space Ghost episodes, there were a lot of things that stood out to me. There was his frankly astonishing array of powers. He's got the power bands, that have lasers and fire and ice and force fields, and he's got the invisible belt that lets him turn invisible. But I think the thing that really stood out to me was Batman has one sidekick, and so that means you can tell stories with or without the sidekick. It kind of feels almost a little like an accessory.
Mhm.
Space Ghost has three, and it's like once is a happenstance, twice is coincidence, three times is a pattern. Like it's clearly like an important part of the text that Space Ghost is not alone, that he's fighting with a whole team of people. And I thought for a little while, I was like, well, we have Jan and Jason, of course, as human beings, like, that's fun to play with them. But I thought for a little bit, I was like, what about Blip? Like, is Blip passe? Can you tell a story with Blip in the year 2024? And as I thought more about it, I was like, you have to. Blip is such a specific choice. It could have been a dog. It could have been, any normal pet. It's a
sure.
monkey.
Yep.
And so if anything, I kind of view Blip as the cherry on top of the sundae. Like, it just wouldn't look right without him. And so without spoiling too much, I'd say Blip is kind of the linchpin of our whole series.
Okay.
He's very important. He kind of, I think, provides the impetus for our entire narrative. And yeah, he's a fun character in that, like, a little of Blip goes a long way. He can't talk, so you have to really, like, I write Blip very differently than I do anybody else, because it's a lot of it is in our artist Jonathan Lau's hands of, like,
Yeah.
all right, you got to make Blip look funny, or you got to have him do something that's funny looking. But I love that he's mischievous, he's food driven, he's loyal to these kids to a fault, and he's smarter than the average ape. But he's a little bit of a wild card. I mean, sometimes, it's going to sound weird, but I'll explain it. He reminds me of, like, Wolverine circa the Hellfire Club,
Okay.
where, like, before the Hellfire Club, like, it's Wolverine. That guy gets, like, thrown around all the time. He got chucked in, like, the first adventure with Krakoa. But then, he's the last man standing, and he's the one who has to kind of, like, even the odds. And that was often Blip's role in the cartoons, was that, everybody's captured except for Blip, and nobody thinks any better of Blip because he's just a monkey. They don't even bother to capture him half the time. And so Blip's going to have a few moments like that in our series, where the chips are down, and never send a kid to do a monkey's job, I guess. But we do have a Blip-centric issue coming up that I'm very excited about. That I think, like, if we nail it, it'll be my favorite of the whole run.
Okay.
So yeah, it's one of those things. I think when you're doing a project like this, when there's a very specific element, like something like Blip, you really want to pay attention to that, and you want to figure out a way to kind of fold that in, because otherwise, like, it doesn't, same way that it wouldn't feel like a Space Ghost book without Jan and Jace, at least to me. I've come around to the line of thinking it wouldn't be a Space Ghost book if Blip wasn't involved either.
Yeah. I mean, from a dialogue perspective, Blip sounds like a very interesting character, and really the onus on the letterer knocking it out of the park
Yeah.
is really, really important there. If
Yeah,
he's the pivot point.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, Blip is very much a team effort in this book, because yeah, he's got it's a limited vocabulary,
Right.
it's just noises. It's varying degrees of scree. So yeah, it's about, like, oh, well, what's the expression you're gonna give you're gonna give Blip, or what's the situation that we can put him in, or what is his dynamic with any of the kids? Can we do something funny with that? And so, yeah, he's been a real treat to write. But it is a challenge because, like I said, you have to tell a lot with very little. And a little for Blip also goes a long way. You don't want to overdo it.
Right.
So yeah, but every issue, and I feel like I've been pretty good about it so far. Every issue, like we're finding something for Blip to do. Because yeah, I think I got that practice in Savage Avengers, is
Yep.
that like you have a team. I think it's on you to have them do something in every issue. Even if it's just like one thing, like if Weapon H has like done something this issue, great. Like then I've justified his presence. So yeah, I think I've been able to take that same approach with Space Ghost, but it is a little easier with only 4 characters and a villain per issue rather than juggling 10.
Yeah, I would imagine so. But I wasn't super familiar with, Jonathan Lau's work, so I checked out his Insta, and dude's work is stellar.
Yeah,
You know,
Jonathan's great.
it reminds me though more of Greg Capullo than Alex Toth, I guess. When
Huh.
you're thinking about some of that stuff, and as a
Yeah,
writer, when you're kind of playing around with your co-creator's strengths in a script,
yeah,
and I really don't know how much of that really factors in, right? Because I'm new to trying to write scripts myself,
yeah.
so how much do you conceptualize yourself, kind of the visuals when you're laying a script out?
Cool. Well, I think especially when you're working on a licensed project like this, oftentimes you've already written your first or second issue before you get an artist on board.
Okay, sure.
So it's very much for me. I've been a fan of Jonathan's for a long time. I was keyed into his work. He did a run on Green Hornet with Kevin Smith back in the day, and so I love how dynamic his work is, and I'm trying to think of like an artist who he reminds me of. Like, I'm just gonna look up this guy real quick to see if that's a similar artist in mind. And nope, doesn't look anything like it, so I'm not gonna say it. But yeah, Jonathan, I love that he's able to kind of toggle between like the moody elements to
Mhm.
like the big explosive action scenes to then these like very endearing character moments.
Mhm.
Like we have a bit in issue 2, and you'll know it when you see it. I wrote it, or you know what? I'll explain it. Yeah, I'll go a little into it so you know when to spot it. Issue 2, we have like a very brief, kind of quick montage of Space Ghost's origin.
Okay.
It's one of those things. I don't feel like the need to belabor the point because, like I said, I think his origin feels pretty simple to me. And I wrote it with a kind of a fun action hook to it. And I thought, okay, this will be fun. Like, like it's cool, but like nothing that I was going to be like, oh, this is like the top moment in my career. And then Jonathan drew it, and I said, oh, I think this is a top moment in my career. Like, it's beautiful. And then he switches gears to watching like Jan and Jace like hanging out on Ghost Planet. And I'm like, I'd step into traffic for those kids. And so that has been like a really cool, that's been very cool to work with. Having an artist who's as versatile as Jonathan, because like I said, this series is very much as a study in contrasts. And there's a lot of things that have to get done in
Mhm.
this. You want to make sure that you've got the drama and you've got the tension and stakes that come with a superhero story, but also you don't want it to get too dour. You don't want it. This is not Robert Pattinson's The Space Ghost, and so you want to kind of cut that drama with warmth and humor.
Okay.
And on top of that, you also want to make sure that you're introducing all these villains in a way that they're recognizable, but also that you can add in little surprises here and there, and also to kind of give Jonathan room to interpret these characters in his own way, because it can't just be me who's allowed to say, okay, I'm going to interpret Space Ghosts and his villains in this way.
Mhm.
Jonathan also deserves a chance to kind of put his own twist on some of these villains. So yeah, he's been a real pro to work with, and he's inhumanly fast. He's trying about a page a day.
Okay.
Um,
Wow.
we are he's about, I want to say he's about a third of the way through issue 3 already. Like moving very, very fast. And so it's all I can kind of do to stay ahead of him. But that's been like, it's been such a treat to see how professionally like he's putting together all these pages. And the thing that I also really admire and appreciate about working with him is that he understands this is an ensemble book.
Mhm.
It would be so easy to just be like, well, it's just Space Ghost, and we're going to put these kids in a corner somewhere and we're going to ignore them. And I think the thing that really struck me is that Jonathan gives every character their just spotlight. And I think that makes this book feel so different from other takes on Space Ghost that we've seen in the past, which I think have been solely focused on Space Ghost or primarily focused on Space Ghost, or it's been Space Ghost and a supporting cast having to share room with other supporting casts like the Herculoids or
Yeah.
anything else at Future Quest. And so, yeah, I think Jonathan does a lot of heavy lifting for us in that he knows that we're able to do like the cool action and spectacle, but he never forgets that there are like characters underneath all of this. And I think that's been a really wonderful collaborative environment.
So as a writer, how do you pace something like this in your scripts? Because you're given an IP with all this range, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that the recent book that I read that didn't work for me was because they were trying to pack too much of like the original villains, the original storyline into the first issue. So it felt very rushed.
Sure.
So how do you pace it properly?
It's a great question. The thing that I really took to doing, Batman: The Long Halloween was a big influence on this book in the way that it was structured.
Okay.
And even looking at what I consider to be the most successful books right now, you look at books like what Ryan North is doing in Fantastic Four. You see what Steve Orlando is doing in Scarlet Witch. You see what Jed McKay is doing on Moon Knight. It's a lot of done in one adventures. And so for me, particularly, and I don't think this is spoiling too much because I would hope that you would expect this in a Space Ghost book, is that if we're going to have the Council of Doom show up, that means we need to introduce the members of the Council of Doom first.
Sure.
And so being able to kind of do a lot of done in one adventures, it means that like we're able to kind of first off give readers a satisfying chunk. Every month they get a self-contained story and they get to learn a little bit more about who Space Ghost is, and they get to learn who the next villain is in every issue. But in so doing, that also means that when we do the occasional two-parter, that means we've given our cliffhangers like the maximum punch, because we know that, if this story is not wrapped up in 22 pages, Space Ghost is really on his heels. Like there's something dire going on that is going to make his comeback in the next issue hopefully feel that much more satisfying. Similar to the way that I structured my Fantastic Four two-parter, whereas sort of, everything's a mess by the end of issue one, and it's okay. Like that means they are in real deep by the time issue two starts, and they got to work that much harder to get themselves out of it. But yeah, I think for me, it's about focusing on, it's one villain at a time, at least for starters. And so that way you can kind of quickly figure out, okay, what's the deal with each of these characters? You can kind of give them a little bit more backstory and a little bit more development. And then it's also, what I consider, I guess, to be the B plot, which is what's up with Space Ghost, Jan, and Jace? How's their dynamic evolving? So we have one issue, for example, it's Jan and Jace's first night on Ghost Planet. And what does that mean? This place that is clearly not meant for children. Or another example is, if Space Ghost says, listen, this villain is too dangerous, I need you to stay behind. And the kids, whether through, sheer impulsiveness or just by happenstance, wind up directly in this guy's crosshairs. What does that mean? What does that mean for just how do these kids get out alive, but also what does that mean for their dynamic moving forward?
Yeah.
And so being able to kind of figure out, okay, this is the A story and here's the B story every single issue. It's actually been a lot of fun. And it's actually, I think it's the kind of pacing that I wish I could do on more projects. And I think Dynamite being so generous with our runway with this, I think has been very helpful in that, I've pitched, and there's room for more, of course, but I've pitched them 12 issues in an annual.
Okay.
So, this is, knock on wood, the industry is in a volatile place, but, barring any catastrophe, this will be my longest run on a book ever to date. And so having that long runway, but also being very aware that like, we don't want to overstay our welcome. It means that I'm able to have a beginning, middle, and end. and I'm able to kind of say, okay, here's the landmarks that I want to hit over this kind of crazy road trip. But I know that here's how I chop that up into 13 parts, and then have a distinct beginning, middle, and end for each one of those 13 parts.
Okay.
So yeah, I think if anything, this has honestly been a dream project in a lot of ways, where I'm able to kind of take the biggest possible swings without really having to worry about, whether or not something, whether or not we're gonna have to wrap up a book or what anybody else is working on. So it really is. It's kind of all the fun of a superhero book with all the freedom of a creator owned.
Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. Like 12 issues really gives you some range, you know. I was
Yeah,
thinking in my head like 6, right? Like, 12. That's awesome. That's
yeah.
fantastic.
And I think that was a big selling point for me for taking on the book was when Joe approached me. He was like, do you have any ideas for about a year? And I was like, could we do 12 in an annual? Like, if we could, I think we could do something really neat. And so yeah, I think it's nice to have a runway like that. I think it also gives me time to kind of get to know these characters better.
Yeah.
And I think it also helps that it kind of gives you a little bit of time to sort of dole out more and more character information, that you're not, I mean, I just came off of a 4-issue Punisher mini where like I knew from the jump we have got to like get things in fast. There's really no room to slow down because we only have, I guess that was 90 pages. We only have 90 pages to explain like what's the deal with this Punisher. What's the deal with Joe Garrison and his origin, and how does he do this whole character arc while fighting villains? You know, I it's a challenge,
Yeah.
and so being able to do something like Space Ghost, where you've got these 4 characters that you get to kind of hang out with for over a year, and just kind of every issue be like, okay, how do they change a little bit? And that it sticks and that it's permanent. That's like something that's very cool, and I think it's that was a big reason why I took on this assignment. Was I realized that this is an opportunity that does not come very often, particularly in this industry, particularly in this genre.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, let's run with it.
Yeah, for sure. There's an aside here, but did you hear George Lowe's voice in your head when you were wanting to write dialogue? I
It's
would
funny.
for
I,
sure.
George Lowe, yeah, he's got that iconic voice. It's funny for me. After I made that little joke about Robert Pattinson's The Space Ghost, whose voice honestly felt like Space Ghost to me, and I channeled a lot while writing this was Michael Keaton.
Okay.
In that like he's a little gruff, but also like he's got a like there is a little bit of a sense of humor, but like with an edge, particularly dealing with these kids who like I think we can tell pretty early on. At first, they are very annoying. He is not happy that like it's his innate heroism that led him to reach out and say like, stay with me. But also like I don't think he realized what kind of commitment he was signing up for,
Hmm.
and kind of how badly these kids would cramp his style. And so, having that kind of like, having that kind of voice where it isn't, it's not one dimensional heroic. And not to say that George Lowe was that, but like George Lowe had that kind of, he was a TV announcer. And that was sort of the voice he had to it. So, yeah, we're trying to human everybody up, I guess is the best way to describe it. And so yeah, we're adding a little bit of some rough edges to Space Ghost's voice. So yeah, Michael Keaton was really, I think, like the North Star for me, and that like that's a guy who's got a lot of range.
Yeah.
And as somebody who kind of inhabited that same archetype as Space Ghost, yeah, it felt very appropriate to the role, I think.
Okay. So if you had to, you've mentally played with the character quite a bit now.
Yeah.
So if you were casting a live action movie, who would
Hmm.
you want to play him?
I saw somebody mention John Hamm a week or so ago, and I was like, that could
That's
be
a good
pretty
one.
cool.
That's a good one.
I could see that. Yeah, John Hamm, I think would be I mean, granted, I think it's all based on like how do they look in the suit, but like, and frankly, I have no idea if the Space Ghost suit would ever work in a live action capacity or not.
Sure.
But yeah, that would definitely be. I think he'd be a fun character for sure.
Yeah, I like Alexander Skarsgård myself.
Oh yeah, that would be neat too. Let me. Yeah, you might be right.
Oh no,
Either of those would
you're
be.
playing with the character. This is just me. Like Skarsgård
Honestly,
was.
though, that's not bad casting. That rips actually. So yeah, I don't think there's no wrong answer to that one for sure.
Okay. Well, Warner Brothers, you heard it here first. Like if you cast him, I need my check because I gave the suggestion. But
That's funny.
well, one of the things I've been curious about with, kind of up and coming writers in the medium is juggling project load,
Yeah.
And I know better than most how much time these things take to develop. So I know you're not writing them all at once, but you still have, multiple things on the shelf. So it still seems like a lot. So do you have a daily writing routine or how do you do that?
Yeah, for me, the toughest part is the development side
Okay.
of it all, because there are certain projects that take longer than others, and it also that gets compounded by your workload. I'm working on an outline for a new assignment right now that like I was hoping to have done a few weeks ago, but I needed to turn in another Space Ghost script, and I needed to do some lettering passes on another Space Ghost issue, and I also needed to do lettering pass in the final issue of The Devil That Wears My Face.
Yep.
So, that part is always like the trickiest part for me because you never know how long that's going to take. You try to make sure that you can get stuff done in like my goal is to try to have an outline done in no later than 4 weeks, and usually 2 to 3 weeks is kind of really the sweet spot I'm aiming for. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely depending on the length of the project and whether how familiar you are with it. That's all part of the variables that you're juggling. When I was writing, last summer was I think the hardest that I had pushed myself in a long time, in that I was writing Moon Knight, City of the Dead, and Punisher, and The Devil That Wears My Face simultaneously.
Wow.
And so I was basically, I'd write an issue of Moon Knight, and then I'd sleep for a day, and then I would write an issue of Devil, and then I'd sleep for a day, and then I would write an issue of Punisher. And usually I can write a script. If I usually I can write a script in about 5 days.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. It depends on if there's any narration involved. Space Ghost does not have narration involved because I've written a lot of that lately, and I wanted to switch gears a little bit. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of triage. Ultimately, I think the overriding concern is you don't want your artist sitting on their hands. You want to make sure that whatever artist is in the chair, that they are always fed. And so that's always the top priority, is just like what's the closest deadline. And then if there's something in development, like in theory that can hold on a little bit because there's no artist attached at the moment, so nobody's waiting.
Right.
But yeah, for me, it's always, and granted, I break up my scripts in a little bit of a different way, in that I do my paneling first. And so usually I can knock out the paneling of a script in a day or two.
Okay.
It's usually a day. If it's 2, if it's like a little more complicated, or if like I'm kind of running up against it in terms of space, and I need to come up with some creative ways to make a shortcut. Dialogue for me, I try to do 5 pages a day, and knowing that like I will often take a hacksaw to my dialogue as soon as the art comes in anyway. I tend to be very, I have an involved process when it comes to lettering, doing a lettering pass script. And so at least that I have the dialogue that feels, if it's 80%, of what I think the final is, I feel pretty good about that. Knowing that I'm going to be tweaking it a lot. So yeah, if I try to wrap up a script, if I can do it every 5 days, I'm in a good spot. It's easier if it's, say, like if I'm doing something for Marvel, where like I know those characters like backwards and forwards, and
yeah,
although there are some characters I know better than others. I mean, I'm working on something for the big 2 right now that like it's a character that's a little more complicated, and so like that means there's more there's more research that has to be done.
Sure.
Similar to what I had to do for Space Ghost, in that the biggest challenge for me writing Space Ghost was figuring out how his powers worked. Because you watch those original cartoons and like he's just got like a million powers, and
he's just blasting all the time, and
yeah, you throw him into any situation, and like if it's not one of the core powers, somehow another power shows up.
Yeah.
And so, for me, it was like, how do I break it down into, okay, one of his power bands controls temperature. And so that's how he does, or it's like ambient particles, where like, one of them controls, fire and ice and laser beams. And the other power band controls atmosphere and pressure. So that's how you get the force fields. And then his Invisobelt, it refracts the visible wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum, and also provides localized anti-gravity, so that explains the flight and the super strength.
God, this is so complicated compared to when I was watching it as a kid. Like you have to do all these things.
Yeah, and granted, we're not going to be similar to the origin. We're not belaboring the point on any of that, but it's just for me in my head as a writer trying to figure out, okay, how does this tech work?
Yeah.
So that way you can kind of figure out how to choreograph a scene, but also how to give him limitations.
Yeah.
In that, like, what happens if his weapons fail or are not available to him? And then you kind of get some interesting stories of like, how does Space Ghost operate when he's at diminished capacity? So anyway, going back to that is, if I have to like do a bunch of research in the Vatican, I'm not going to be writing that week's script.
Sure.
That week will probably be research. And so, it's a matter of just kind of, you're staying on top of the pressing deadlines and then trying to chip away at the not as pressing deadlines. But yeah, it's tricky. I mean, it's something that I'm constantly refining. I'm constantly trying to figure out, like, how do I kind of have the maximum amount of energy to do what I need to be doing. And so, I've been focusing a lot. I go to the gym multiple times a week. I'm focusing on my hydration. I'm focusing on my sleep and my vitamins. And even just the food that I'm eating, because I know that this job is kind of like being like an athlete, where you have to just kind of be on, and also then conversely forgiving yourself when you're not. Like if you put your butt in the chair and you write something, even if it's crappy, and even if you're going to toss all of it tomorrow, like, it's cool. You got the crappy stuff out. So that's sort of my work in progress process.
Nice.
But I constantly am like thinking about, like, how do I get faster at this? Because I see, it's very kind of you to say that I'm working on a lot of stuff, but I see other creators all the time who I'm like, I don't know how they do that. I don't know how Josh Williamson writes the number of books that Josh Williamson writes, or Ron V, or or Jed McKay for that matter. Like, they have to have clones of themselves in the basement or something. Like, I just don't know how they do it. But that's I think something that I really like about my own journey as a creator, is this knowing that, like, you can still get better at this. And so every project that I do, I'm always thinking, like, okay, how do I do this in a better way than I did the previous project? And I think that growth as a creator is what kind of keeps me stimulated and excited about the work.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting too, going back and listening to your interview with Jimmy, because you were talking about being influenced by other things, and that might give you an idea that is like, okay, now here's my bucket list or my checklist with comics. Like, so what, if you can, what would Space Ghost be? Like, what do you check box with Space Ghost?
Well, let's see. There are a few things. Well, a couple of influences. I mentioned Batman Long Halloween. Being able to do something with like a long rogues gallery, that's cool, because I've never really had I've never had a book where I've worked with a character that's had like a big iconic rogues gallery before.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, like Moon Knight is not exactly known for like his deep bench of villains. And that was half the challenge on coming up with our Punisher run, is that, like, there's a reason that like the Punisher doesn't have a rogues gallery, is because they tend not to survive like the first fight. So having like basically being gifted like a Batman level rogues gallery, like, yes, that rules. I think also though the ability to reimagine a little bit. J.J. Abrams with Star Trek is one of my favorite movies because I didn't grow up as I grew up with Next Generation, which I always view as like Claremont's X-Men in space. But I think I never really grew up with Shatner or Leonard Nimoy, and so watching that Star Trek movie, I was like, I get it now. It was able to take those core elements of those iconic characters and kind of bring them to the forefront in a very dynamic way, but in a way that was also very accessible for new viewers, that you didn't have to watch a bunch of Star Trek to appreciate. Oh, James Kirk, like, I get it. He's Hal Jordan, in a lot of ways. And so being able to kind of like, really think about that for these characters, I think is a way that I certainly approached it. I'm trying to think what other stories that really, even like, like kind of the lone wolf and cub of it all. I've touched into it a little bit in like Spencer and Locke and recently Moon Knight City of the Dead. But I think having like an ongoing story of like a hero proving that he's a hero by, he's protecting the little guy. And in this case, it's a pair of orphan teenagers. And granted, like, it's cool to have them as sidekicks, and Jan and Jace are certainly very active in this book. I made it a point that like I want to make sure that they have their own agency here, that they're not just like the boy and girl hostage. But I think being able to do an extended run on that is something I've never been able to do. Where so often, and this is a criticism of my own work that I have, is that, I have Detective Locke protecting his daughter Hero, or I have Moon Knight protecting Khalil, and they're hostages. Like you don't have the room to make them much more than a hostage, and so being able to like, be like, oh no, these kids have agency too. Like that's cool. I've never really been able to do that. So yeah, I'm trying to think of some other bucket list things for this. Well, there's certain things I don't want to spoil.
Of course.
There's definitely like there's certain archetypes, certain villain archetypes that I've wanted to write for a while that I just never found the right fit for. That I'm like, that fits for Space Ghost. That fits, Zorak in particular. I am in the middle of writing a story involving him, and like that, I'm like, oh, okay, like that. That's a type of villain that I've never written before, but I really like. And same thing for Metallus coming up. Immediately, I'm like, oh, that's a villain that like I've come close. I guess writing Ultron is sort of the closest thing I've gotten to that type of villain, but even that was not quite the same.
Okay.
And so like being able to kind of dig into that a little deeper, I'm like, oh yeah, that's super fun. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think also I think bucket list was, I've wanted to do more sci-fi for a long time. It's one of those things that it's the natural bumps in the road when it comes to being a comics creator. Like, I have a book called Grand Theft Astro that has been in development for much longer than I would like for it to be. It's been long written. It's just, it's trying to fit in time in our artist schedule to draw enough of it that we could then release it or Kickstarter or what have you. And I'm like, oh, that's like a real fun sci-fi swing that nobody but me has read. And I have Savage Avengers, which I think was kind of like science fantasy, and had some sci-fi components to it. But I've been thinking for a long time, and I guess, my Avengers Guardians team up in Avengers Unlimited had some degree of sci-fi. But I was like, I've never really done like a big swing sci-fi project, and so Space Ghost, it's basically, if you don't know who Space Ghost is, imagine Batman in Flash Gordon's universe, and so being able to do something in that kind of environment and being able to kind of lean into my favorite genre, which is superheroes, and being able to do it in this big kind of crazy sci-fi world, that's something that, like I said, it's rare. I mean, especially especially at Marvel. I mean, how many books do you have that kind of fit that realm? You have Guardians,
Right.
and Nova, and maybe the Silver Surfer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those books are always like an acquired taste as well. Like
Yep.
those books are never the marquee books. And you see it on the other side of the street at DC, where like Superman is kind of like that, but he's operating in the real world. He's not always in space. The Legion of Superheroes kind of comes and goes. I love the Legion. It's like Green Lantern, I guess. Green Lantern is probably like the next best thing.
Sure.
And real talk, like I like my villains better. So I should tease Jeremy Adams next time I see him, because he's doing such a great job on Green Lantern. But if I had to choose one or the other, I would be choosing my book in a heartbeat.
Yeah, my definitive sci-fi for me is like the original Lobo run, where,
Yeah,
and I'm
Lobo's
picturing a lot
great.
of, yeah, a lot of these elements that in my head I'm thinking probably will be touched on here. Just off-planet stuff, on-planet stuff, hopping around here and there all over the place. So that's at least where my brain went. But
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, Lobo's a great. That's a character I would love to write someday. But at the same time, I kind of feel like I might have scratched that itch a little bit with Space Ghost.
I always ask people, what they got coming up before they wrap up, and I typically don't include a wish list, but I'm personally hoping that Dynamite can pick up a few more rights and you get to write Space Stars, because I'm a huge Herculoids fan, right? They need their time in the sun, so I'm manifesting this into the reality. So who do I need to talk to?
Boy, if I had a nickel for every time somebody asked for the Herculoids,
Really?
oh boy, I probably get something about the Herculoids at least once a week on Twitter ever since we announced this book, often multiple times a week.
Okay.
There's no plans at the moment, and part of that is it's a separate license, and
Yeah.
also part of it is Jeff Parker did such a good job in Future Quest throwing together Space Ghost and the Herculoids and Johnny Quest and Birdman and Frankenstein Jr. and Mighty Mightor. That I don't know if I would, I don't know if I could compete with that. It's a great book. It already exists. There would certainly have to be a lot more homework done. Because even when I was rewatching my Space Stars, I ordered the DVD. I was just watching Space Ghost. It was very much like I have to focus on just this thing. I can't muddy the waters too much because I'll forget something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, never say never. I mean, my thinking is Warner Brothers has done this license, and granted, I don't know how the licensing thing works over there. I've just been fortunate enough to kind of read notes just for my project. But yeah, I would love to see a team up with like Thundercats. I mean, Declan Shalvey and Drew Moss are doing such a great job. I would love to see, if Space Ghost is Space Batman, I want to know who his Space Superman is. I want to see that team up. So yeah, something like Thundercats would be real neat. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else is under the licensing agreement. Yeah, I mean, we've already seen him with Johnny Quest, and I don't know if he would fit with Powerpuff Girls, but Thundercats, Space Ghost trio, sign me right up. Declan, have your people call my people.
There you go. Well, what else you got dropping right now?
Yeah,
I know there's that Punisher trade is May, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Let's see. That might be right. Yeah, that book comes out the last week of May. So yeah, you can pre-order our Punisher trade through your local comic shop. You can also pre-order the last issue of The Devil That Wears My Face, issue 6. Comes out May 8th, so the Wednesday after Space Ghost #1. But yeah, Space Ghost. That's really my big swing for 2024. You can pre-order issue 1 at your local comic shop. Issue 2 should be up for pre-orders, I think, by next week. And we've got some great covers for both of those. But yeah, tell them to add Space Ghost to your pull list. Like I said, we've got a pretty long runway planned and room for more stories if the demand is there. But Yeah, and just came out recently, the trade paperback for Moon Knight City of the Dead that came out, I think it was the end of February. So you can also order that wherever comics are sold.
Awesome. Yeah, those Francesco Mattina covers are
Great.
crazy for the Space Ghost stuff.
Yeah.
Crazy. So good.
That issue 2 cover in particular is, I think he's given Alex Ross a run for his money. And
Yeah.
that is exactly what I told my editor. So yeah, I'm very excited. We've got some amazing cover artists. We've got Jay Lee, who did an amazing cover with Zorak for our second issue. Although full disclaimer, Zorak is showing up a little bit later in the series. And then we got Bjorn Behrens, who did the teaser image that we did for right before our official announcement. And then Michael Cho, who's doing these amazing retro Gold Key inspired covers.
I love those. They're so good.
They're very cool. And I know he has mentioned that he's on for, I think he said 12 issues. So yeah, we got him for a good long while. And I hope to say the same for everybody else, because they are really just crushing it.
All right. Well, thanks so much for hanging out with me again on the show, David. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for everyone listening. Call your local comic shop, pre-order Space Ghost, pre-order The Devil That Wears My Face, pre-order Punisher, because my puppy's kibble does not come cheap.
Yeah. Big May for you. Hopefully she gets a nice new collar or something. Yes. You got something. Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, this is Byron O'Neill, and on behalf of all of us at Comic Book Yeti, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today for this episode of the Cryptid Creator Corner. We also have a podcast of the same name that you can download wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Cryptid Creator Corner, maybe you would enjoy our sister podcast, Into the Comics Cave. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.